Right, hi and welcome to Mrs. Long's second video on the Picture of Dorian Gray, chapter 14. We're picking up in the middle of Dorian's conversation with Alan, um, where he is trying to convince slash manipulate Alan to dispose of Basil's body. When he suggests or he says to Alan that it was suicide, Alan says, yes, I suppose you drove him to it. Then he eventually confesses that it was murder. I killed him. You don't know what he made me suffer. Again, Dorian is reflecting it onto himself. He killed Basil because Basil made him suffer. This whole murder is terrible because it's causing him anguish. When he says poor Basil, he says what a terrible way for a man to die. So there's a sense of removal of himself from the situation. The only way he's in the situation is because of what he's suffering. Whatever my life is, he says, he had more to do with the making or marring of it than poor Harry has had. He may not have intended it, the result was the same. Now, we've discussed this before, but Dorian seems to think that because Basil painted the portrait, it's his fault, and not the fact that Harry suggested to him the ideas about hedonism and aging and youth and beauty. So whether it's because Basil is an easy target for blame, or he doesn't want to blame Harry, even though he acknowledges Henry's theories are poisonous, he still enjoys indulging in them because they play to the temperaments or the evil things he already has going on inside of him and just lets them come out. Whatever it is, he repeatedly blames Basil. And perhaps it's easier to blame Basil. And now he thinks if Basil's dead, then life will be easier for him. Remember, Basil was sort of the thorn in his side, telling him things he didn't want to hear anyway. This is Alan's reaction. Murder, good God, Dorian, is that which you've come to? I shall not inform upon you. It's not my business. I have no desire to help you, he says. Why would I help you? And so Dorian's last-ditch attempt before the blackmail is, I beg of you, we were friends once. Don't speak about those days, Dorian, says Alan Campbell. They are dead. And so once Dorian has established that Alan has refused, he becomes pitiful. And as I said in the previous video, he almost is very condescending in the way he treats Alan. And he stretches out his hand, takes a piece of paper, he writes something on it, and he folds it and he pushes it across the table. The reader never gets to know what it is that is on this paper. But as I mentioned in the previous video too, that we can pretty much guess the kinds of things that Dorian would have on Alan. Clearly, it's something enough to ruin his life to the point where he would rather dispose of a dead body and implicate himself in a murder than have his secrets revealed to the public. So Campbell looks at him in surprise, takes the paper, opens it, and as he's reading it, he becomes pale. So we know that whatever is contained in it is enough to have a physical effect on his body. Becomes physically ill. Dorian murmurs that he's sorry for Alan, but you leave me no alternative. I have a letter written. Here it is. So that was the second letter that Dorian wrote that he put in his pocket. You see the address? If you don't help me, I must send it. If you don't help me, I will send it. I tried to spare you. You will do me the justice to admit that. So he seems he's acting magnanimous as if he's now doing Alan a favor, that at least he tried to convince him to do the deed before he resorted to blackmail, as if that makes any difference. Dorian returns to his very matter-of-fact tone, and he says, the thing is quite simple. Come, it has to be done. A groan broke from Alan Campbell's lips, and he shivered all over. The ticking on the clock on the mantelpiece seemed to him to be dividing time into separate atoms of agony. Lovely reference there to atoms because of Alan Campbell's profession, which is science, each of which is too terrible to be borne. And so what Alan Campbell does is he says, he says, I cannot do it, but then he realizes he doesn't have a choice. He's just sort of paying lip service at this point. So he wants to go out and buy the equipment, that the supplies that he needs. But of course, Dorian cannot risk him leaving the house because, if you were our Alan Campbell, we would just gap it and run for the hills. So he gets his servant to go and buy the equipment, and then when the servant returns, he sends him away. So you see how he's keeping everybody who's involved in this plot only partly responsible for separate things, so that nobody could ever put all of the clues together, aside from Alan Campbell, who could not afford to do that. So they obviously spend quite an awkward few moments while waiting for the servant to return with the equipment. And while they are waiting, Campbell takes this opportunity to confront Dorian in a way and says, "You are infamous." "Hush, Alan, you have saved my life," said Dorian. "Your life, good heavens, what a life is that! You have gone from corruption to corruption, and now you have culminated in crime." So he, without seeing the painting, can make this judgment of Dorian, that Dorian has absolutely destroyed his life with his corruption. And Dorian, just as he doesn't take Basil seriously, he sighs and says, "I wish you had 1,000th part of the pity for me that I have for you." Do you see how he manages to come out on top here by pitying Alan Campbell? Because it's a weakness to admit that you need somebody else's pity, but he doesn't see himself as being as much of a victim as Alan sees him, and so therefore he doesn't feel like he needs pity, probably. Okay, so Campbell says it'll take him about 5 hours, and Dorian sends Francis away. Now, when he shows Alan up to the schoolroom, at first he says, "I don't think I can go in." Remember, he doesn't want to look on what he's done. It's a Macbeth moment, where Macbeth says, I cannot even think about what I've done. Look on it, I dare not. And Alan says, Alan says, "Well, it doesn't matter. I don't need you. I don't require you." But as Dorian opens the door, he realizes that the portrait is not covered. On the floor in front of the torn curtain was lying the torn curtain lying in front of the painting, and spreading sunlight onto the face. And he'd forgotten that for the first time, he'd forgotten to cover the canvas. Of course, he was in a state because of what had just happened. And so he's about to rush in, it's his first instinct to cover up this portrait, but he hesitates. And as he hesitates, he sees that there is now blood glistening on one of the hands of the portrait, which obviously the portrait is now showing evidence of his murder. And how horrible it was, but more horrible was the silent thing. Remember, he doesn't refer to it as Basil, it's a thing. The thing whose grotesque misshape and shadow on the spotted carpet showed him that it had not stirred, but was still there as he had left it. So he steels himself, heaves a deep breath, opens the door, and with half-closed eyes and averted head, he can't even bear to look at the dead man. He quickly goes and covers up the painting. Now, it's really interesting that he is willing for Alan Campbell to see the dead body, but he's not willing for him to see the painting. Why? Because he's vain, and the painting shows him as ugly and old. And even though he knows Alan is aware of the deeds he's committed, he's still not willing for him to see the effect it's actually had on him, because he would then be exposing everything, his soul, his body, and the ruse would be up, because he could not then maintain his the idea of his beauty and his eternal youth. He wonders briefly when once he's let Alan into the room, if they've ever met, and if so, what had they thought of each other? But he doesn't put too much thought into that because he knows that Alan isn't going to say anything anyway. And so hours later, Campbell comes back and he's pale and he says, I've done what you've asked me to do, and now goodbye. Let us never see each other again. You've saved me from ruin, Alan, says Dorian. I cannot forget that. And you can imagine the kind of things that poor Alan Campbell would be experiencing. And later on in the book, we hear of his fate, probably as a result of what Dorian has got him to do. You know, those of you who have watched, I'm not going to get into the gory details, but if you've watched any sort of crime drama or crime series, or if you've got any knowledge of what it would take to make a dead body go from being this physical thing to being nothing, you can only imagine the kind of horrific acts that Alan would have had to perform in those ensuing hours. And everything is gone when Dorian goes upstairs. There's a horrible smell of nitric acid, but the thing, again, not Basil, that had been sitting at the table was gone. And so for now, at least, the biggest piece of evidence against Dorian has been removed. He's managed to do it in a way that he can fairly certainly guarantee no one else besides Alan will ever know. And he, for now at least, has a sense of relief, you can imagine.